Hello, Highworth Church. I want to ask you a question. What do you think of when you hear the word holiness? Do you think of sins? Do you think of things you should stop doing? Do you think of things that perhaps you should give up? Or do you even think of God himself as one of his attributes? Well, I want to challenge you this evening, and I want to challenge you that when you think of the word holiness, you think of presence, discipline, and doing. Presence, discipline, and doing. And we'll look at all three of those, and hopefully they will change or help develop your understanding of holiness. Presence. When Moses was looking after his father-in-law's sheep in the desert in Exodus 3, he suddenly came across a burning bush. Now, this happened quite often in where he was, but the problem with this one was it wasn't burnt up. It was on fire, but it wasn't being consumed. So he said to himself, I'm going to go and have a look at this site and see what is really happening. And as he drew near, God spoke to him out of the midst of the bush. And what he said to Moses was simply this: take your shoes off, for the place you stand upon is holy ground. You see, the presence of God made what was to Moses a very ordinary place to take his sheep suddenly became holy. And then in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah is in the temple and he says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, his train filled the temple, and suddenly angels began to fly around and they called out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord. And Isaiah said, oh dear, I'm ruined. I am undone. Why? Because the place suddenly became holy by the presence of God, and in that holiness, Isaiah felt his need of cleansing and forgiveness. And when Jesus, in Matthew 1, when the angel came to tell Mary about her pregnancy and that it was the Holy Spirit, Jesus is called Emmanuel, God with us. And so my question, in fact, my challenge is this: are you consciously aware of the presence of God? Or do you simply quote a verse, head knowledge, and tell yourself it's true that he's always there? See, when we become consciously aware of God, change occurs. And change will always occur when we are consciously aware of God's presence. And that means we're journeying towards holiness, being holy. So my challenge is this: become more and more consciously aware of the living presence of God with you at all times, and watch the change that begins to happen towards holiness. The second thing was discipline. Now, I want to read to you part of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 7 and verse 10. Endure hardship as discipline. Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. What sort of discipline makes us share the holiness of God? Well, the writer to Hebrews in verse 7 says, endure hardships as the discipline of God. And hardships mean that in our lives we have trials, difficulties, all kinds of hard things. But they're our training towards holiness. Holiness is not punishment for our failures. Hardships are not punishment for our failures. They are our training to share in God's holiness. So my second challenge is simply this. Do you endure the difficulties of life and know you're becoming more and more like him? Holiness is at work in you through enduring hardships. And the third thing that I want to share with you is doing. Jesus is called in Luke chapter 1 and verse 35, the Holy One. So doing is behaving like Jesus, for that is true holiness. And at the end of the Sermon of the Mount, Jesus said in Matthew 7 and verse 21, not everyone who says unto me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father. What then is the will of his Father? Well, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through to chapter 7, almost everything Jesus said teaches about character that leads to action. And as we ask the Holy Spirit to align our lives with the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount and obey that teaching and start behaving like Jesus in our living, we enter into holiness. We become more holy. So my challenge ends with this. Do you live like Jesus lived? Do people see his love manifest through you? Do people feel his healing touch when you pray for them? Do the poor understand he cares as you give something to help them? I hope this has changed your thought of holiness, presence, discipline, and doing.